The political knives are out, the scandals are piling up, and insiders are whispering what nobody wants to say out loud. Danielle Smith might be finished. What I'm about to reveal are the subtle signs, the behind-the-scenes maneuvers, and the mounting pressure that suggest Alberta's most controversial premier could be planning her exit strategy. These aren't just rumors or speculation. These are concrete political indicators that experienced watchers know signal the beginning of the end. From defensive social media rants that sound eerily like Nixon's final days, to a corruption scandal that's making international headlines, to the telling silence from her own caucus members, the writing may already be on the wall by the end. Of this analysis, you'll understand why political insiders are quietly preparing for what could be one of the most dramatic political resignations in Canadian history. Before we dive deep into this political earthquake that's building, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story is developing rapidly and you won't want to miss any updates. Give this video a thumbs up if you think Smith's days are numbered, and drop a comment below with your prediction on how this all plays out, because the next few weeks could be absolutely explosive for Alberta politics. Let's start with the most damning evidence that nobody's talking about publicly, the corrupt care scandal that's been quietly destroying Smith's credibility since February 2025. This isn't just another political controversy, this is a full-blown corruption allegation that goes to the heart of government integrity. The scandal centers around accusations that Smith's government improperly pressured Alberta Health Services to sign lucrative contracts with private surgical facilities, essentially rigging the system to benefit specific companies at taxpayer expense. Here's what makes this scandal potentially career-ending for Smith. The former CEO of Alberta Health Services, Athena Mentzelopoulos, was fired in January 2025, and she's now claiming it was because she launched an internal investigation into government interference with healthcare contracts. Mentzelopoulos isn't going quietly. She's filed a $1.7 million wrongful dismissal lawsuit that threatens to expose the inner workings of Smith's administration. When senior bureaucrats start filing multi-million-dollar lawsuits against the government, it's usually because they have evidence that could bring down politicians. The most telling sign of Smith's vulnerability came in her response to these allegations. Instead of the measured, confident denial you'd expect from a secure leader, Smith posted what political observers described as a truculent and defensive statement on social media that directly channeled Richard Nixon's infamous declaration. The comparison to Nixon isn't accidental. It's the same kind of desperate, defensive posture that historically precedes political collapse, but the corruption scandal is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Smith's handling of Alberta's healthcare system has created a cascade of problems that are now threatening her political survival. Over 200 physicians signed a letter calling for an investigation into political interference, and at least one doctor resigned in protest, specifically citing political interference from Danielle Smith's office. When healthcare professionals, traditionally apolitical, start organizing against a premier, it signals a fundamental breakdown in governance. The pattern of behavior is consistent and concerning. Smith has systematically removed or sidelined healthcare leaders who opposed her privatization agenda. She fired the AHS CEO, shuffled the deputy health minister, and attacked AHS management publicly, accusing them of trying to stop her government's changes. This isn't normal political disagreement. This is the behavior of a leader who's lost control of the policy process and is lashing out at the public service. What makes Smith's position even more precarious is the timing of these scandals. The corrupt care allegations emerged just months after she survived a leadership review with 91.5% support in November 2024. At the time, that seemed like a strong mandate, but political observers who understand Alberta's history know that even high approval ratings can evaporate quickly when corruption allegations emerge. The 91.5% figure might actually work against her now. It means she has further to fall and fewer allies prepared for a fight. The silence from Smith's own caucus is perhaps the most ominous sign of all. In normal times, when a premier faces unfair attacks, their MLAs and cabinet ministers rush to defend them publicly, but during the corrupt care scandal, Smith has been largely isolated, making defensive statements alone while her supposed allies remain conspicuously quiet. This kind of political isolation is often the precursor to caucus revolts and leadership challenges. Behind the scenes, there are reports of growing unrest within the UCP caucus. MLAs are reportedly concerned about being associated with Smith's increasingly toxic brand, especially as corruption allegations continue to dominate headlines. The party's polling numbers might still look decent, but individual MLAs are worried about their own electoral prospects if they're seen as too closely tied to a scandal-plagued premier. The federal political context makes Smith's position even more tenuous. With Donald Trump back in the White House and Canada-US relations likely to become more complex, Alberta needs steady, competent leadership that can navigate federal-provincial relations effectively. Smith's track record of inflammatory statements and her tendency toward confrontation make her poorly suited for the kind of diplomatic leadership that Alberta will need in the coming years. Smith's history of political instability is also working against her. This is someone who resigned as Wildrose Party leader after crossing the floor to the Progressive Conservatives, only to make a political comeback years later. Her previous resignation shows that she's willing to quit when political pressure becomes unbearable, and many observers believe she's approaching that threshold again. The media narrative around Smith has shifted dramatically in recent months. Where once she was covered as a controversial but competent political figure, the coverage now focuses on scandal, incompetence, and political isolation. The tone of political journalism is often a leading indicator of political fortunes, and the tone around Smith has become unmistakably negative. International observers are also starting to take notice of Alberta's political instability. The province's reputation as a stable, business-friendly jurisdiction is being undermined by constant political drama and corruption allegations. This kind of reputational damage can have real economic consequences, and business leaders are quietly expressing concerns about the province's political leadership. The psychological pressure on Smith must be enormous. Being premier is already one of the most demanding jobs in Canadian politics, but doing it while facing constant scandal, media criticism, and political isolation is virtually impossible to sustain long-term. The stress of defending the indefensible, while trying to govern a complex province like Alberta, would break most politicians. What makes resignation increasingly likely is that Smith might see it as her best option for preserving her legacy and avoiding further legal or political consequences. If the corrupt care investigation continues to develop, and if more evidence of government interference emerges, resignation might become not just politically expedient but legally necessary. The timing would also make sense politically. If Smith resigns in the coming months, she can claim that she's leaving on her own terms rather than being forced out by scandal or caucus revolt. This kind of face-saving resignation is common in politics when leaders realize their position has become untenable. There are already whispers about potential successors within the UCP when political insiders start openly discussing who might replace a sitting leader. It's usually a sign that the leader's position is weaker than it appears publicly. The fact that these conversations are happening suggests that Smith's inner circle may be preparing for the possibility of her departure. The precedent of Jason Kenney's resignation is also relevant here. Kenney stepped down after receiving only 51.4% support in a leadership review, recognizing that he'd lost the confidence of his party. Smith received much higher support, but the corruption allegations and ongoing scandals have fundamentally changed her political calculus since then. Smith's increasingly erratic public behavior is another warning sign. Her defensive social media posts, her attacks on public servants, and her isolated responses to criticism all suggest someone under enormous pressure who may be approaching a breaking point. This kind of behavior often precedes political resignations. The electoral mathematics are also working against Smith. While the UCP might still be polling well provincially, Smith's personal approval ratings have been declining, and individual MLAs are starting to worry about their own re-election prospects. When caucus members believe a leader has become an electoral liability, leadership challenges typically follow quickly. The financial implications of the corrupt care scandal are staggering and add another layer of pressure that Smith may find impossible to withstand. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that may have been misallocated through improper government interference. When corruption allegations involve this kind of money, they tend to develop a life of their own, with investigations, audits, and legal proceedings that can drag on for years. Smith may be calculating that resignation is preferable to spending the rest of her political career defending these allegations. What's particularly damaging is how this scandal undermines Smith's core political brand. She positioned herself as someone who would clean up Alberta politics, who would be different, from the old boys club that had dominated the province for decades. But the corrupt care allegations paint a picture of exactly the kind of backroom dealing and corporate favoritism that Smith claimed to oppose. This kind of fundamental contradiction between public persona and alleged private behavior is politically devastating. The legal exposure is another factor that political observers believe may be driving Smith toward the exit. If the allegations prove true, we could be looking at criminal investigations, not just political embarrassment. The RCMP has been known to investigate corruption allegations involving government contracts, and Smith's team must be acutely aware that resignation might be their best strategy for limiting legal exposure. The timing of Smith's increasingly desperate public statements is also telling. Political veterans know that when leaders start making Nixon-style declarations about their integrity, it's usually because they know damaging information is about to become public. Smith's defensive posture suggests she may be trying to get ahead of even more serious revelations that haven't surfaced yet. Let's talk about the caucus dynamics that nobody's discussing openly. Sources within the UCP suggest there have been closed-door meetings where MLAs have expressed serious concerns about Smith's leadership. While no one is openly calling for her resignation yet, the kind of private grumbling that's reportedly happening is exactly how leadership challenges begin. When MLAs start meeting in small groups to discuss their leader's future, that leader's days are usually numbered. The provincial economic context makes Smith's position even more precarious. Alberta is facing significant fiscal challenges with commodity prices volatile and federal-provincial relations strained. The province needs steady, competent leadership focused on economic issues, not a premier who's constantly distracted by scandal and political survival. Business leaders who initially supported Smith are reportedly growing concerned about the instability and distraction that her controversies create. Smith's relationship with her own staff and advisors is also showing signs of strain. There are reports of high turnover in the Premier's office, with experienced political operatives choosing to distance themselves from her administration. When seasoned political professionals start abandoning a leader, it's usually because they see the writing on the wall and don't want to be associated with what they perceive as a sinking ship. The federal dimension adds another layer of complexity that may be pushing Smith toward resignation. With Canada facing potential trade disputes and diplomatic challenges with the Trump administration, federal-provincial cooperation will be crucial. Smith's confrontational approach and scandal-plagued reputation make her poorly suited to the kind of collaborative leadership that Alberta will need to protect its interests in national discussions. What makes this situation even more volatile is Smith's own personality and political history. This is someone who has shown a willingness to make dramatic political moves when she feels cornered. Her previous resignation as Wildrose leader demonstrates that she's not someone who will cling to power at any cost. If she concludes that her position is untenable, she may move quickly and decisively to resign, rather than endure a prolonged political death spiral. The opposition parties are also applying increasing pressure that may be wearing down Smith's resolve. The NDP has been relentless in pursuing the corruption allegations, and they show no signs of letting up. Rachel Notley and her team have been methodically building the case against Smith, and the cumulative effect of constant political attacks takes a toll on any leader. Smith may be calculating that resignation is preferable to months or years of this kind of political warfare. The media investigation aspect is particularly concerning for Smith's future. Investigative journalists are reportedly digging deeper into the healthcare privatization contracts and government interference allegations. When media outlets commit significant resources to investigating a political leader, they usually find additional problems that make the original scandal look minor by comparison. Smith's team must be worried about what other shoes might drop as these investigations continue. The international embarrassment factor cannot be understated. Alberta's reputation on the global stage has been damaged by the constant political sea drama and corruption allegations. For a province that depends heavily on international investment and trade relationships, this kind of reputational damage has real economic consequences. Smith may be concluding that her continued presence as Premier is actually harmful to Alberta's interests. Looking at the psychological profile of political resignations, Smith is exhibiting many of the classic warning signs. The defensive public, statements, the isolation from caucus colleagues, the increasingly erratic behavior, and the apparent stress are all consistent with leaders who are approaching their breaking point. Political office is incredibly demanding under the best circumstances, but trying to govern while under constant investigation and criticism is nearly impossible to sustain. The precedent set by other scandal-plagued politicians is also relevant here. Leaders who try to tough out serious corruption allegations rarely succeed in rehabilitating their reputations. The political graveyard is littered with politicians who thought they could weather serious ethical scandals only to find that the damage was irreversible. Smith may be learning this lesson and concluding that resignation is her best option for preserving whatever political legacy she might still have. The practical governance challenges are also mounting. It's becoming increasingly difficult for Smith to advance her policy agenda when she's constantly responding to scandal allegations and political attacks. The business of government requires focus, political capital, and collaborative relationships, all of which have been eroded by the ongoing controversies. Smith may be recognizing that she can no longer effectively govern Alberta while dealing with these distractions. The electoral calculations are particularly stark. Even if the UCP maintains decent polling numbers provincially, Smith's personal brand has been severely damaged. Individual MLAs are starting to worry that association with Smith could hurt their own re-election prospects. When caucus members begin to see their leader as an electoral liability rather than an asset, leadership challenges typically follow quickly. Looking at all these factors together, the corruption scandal, the legal exposure, the financial implications, the caucus unrest, the media investigations, the international embarrassment, the psychological pressure, the governance challenges, and the electoral concerns, the signs are pointing toward a leader who may be preparing to cut her losses and resign before the situation gets even worse. The convergence of so many negative factors creates a political perfect storm that very few leaders can survive. The only questions remaining may be whether Smith jumps before she's pushed, whether she can find a face-saving way to exit the political stage, and how much additional damage will be done to Alberta's reputation before this political crisis finally resolves itself.